Masam never dun dun dun, yeah. Masam never dun dun dun, yeah. Masam never dun. Yamma say video groovy. Hey, me say you wanna do me. Open my sorry, I want you dream be yeah, me say you bottom. To crack what's in you will be ready to rock on cool for away. Oh,
Welcome back by the fireside. Tonight, I want to talk about love. Not love as fantasy, not love as performance, and not love as something we are told to be grateful for just because it appears. Tonight, I want to talk about love as recognition. There is a phrase that stayed with me after I heard it once on a podcast clip, an Instagram reel that disappeared before I could save it, but the phrase lodged itself in my body. I'm feeling like I may misquote it, but love me the gay way. And I knew immediately why it stayed. Because it named something I've lived, and something many queer and trans people live, but rarely get language for. When people talk about identity, they usually think first about gender or sexuality. But honestly, for queer and trans people, identity is often the least of what we're dealing with. Until it comes to love. Because when it comes to love, romantic, communal, relational, identity becomes everything. And I don't just mean who you sleep with. I mean how you understand yourself, how you move through the world, what you believe about power, what you refuse to compromise. Love cannot exist if someone is in love with a version of you that is easier, quieter, or less demanding than who you actually are. That's what I mean when I say, love me the gay way. Love me in a way that recognizes all of me, not just the parts that are attractive, aesthetic, or palatable. We often collapse the word queer into one thing, but it isn't. There is queer as an umbrella term, identity, orientation, community. And then there is queer as political positioning. Queer as refusal, queer as disruption, queer as consciousness. Sometimes I say, half jokingly, but also half seriously, that I'm Malcolm X or Thomas Sankara in a gay body. People laugh because it sounds provocative. But what I'm really saying is this. My queerness is not primarily about desire. It's about how I understand liberation, power, and selfhood. And this is where love often breaks down. Because many people are comfortable loving a queer person, but deeply uncomfortable loving a political queer. So in this podcast, I mentioned where a trans person spoke about leaving a relationship. Their partner loved them genuinely, but not as the person they knew themselves to be. They were loved as who they were seen as, not who they understood themselves to be. And that difference matters, because love that misrecognizes you doesn't arrive as violence. It arrives as affection paired with erasure. You begin to explain yourself, edit yourself, translate yourself, until love becomes a site of self-abandonment. And I realized this isn't rare. Queer love often fails not because of lack of feeling, but because of lack of recognition. We don't talk enough about how queer identity is sold, especially to younger people. It's packaged as aesthetic, liberal, emotionally expressive but politically quiet, visible but non-threatening. This is not accidental. It is conditioning. White liberal queerness is rewarded because it doesn't disrupt power, it doesn't challenge institutions, it doesn't threaten donors, it doesn't name rot. And this logic travels. It travels into NGOs, into African queer spaces, into art, into relationships. Queer people who speak the language of white liberalism are uplifted. Queer people who refuse it are framed as difficult, divisive, or unsafe. And love does not exist in a vacuum. It absorbs these logics too. I want to share a small example, not because it's dramatic, but because it's familiar. After I returned from Finland last year, a friend reached out from France. They had tried before to introduce me to their circles. It never quite worked out. This time they mentioned someone connected to a magazine. I said yes, but I was clear. I told them, verbatim, this is the work I do, and I'm very political. I asked them to pass that on because I don't believe in entering spaces under false pretenses. And once again, it didn't work out. At the time, I didn't have language for everything I understand now. But even then, I could feel the pattern. Things fall apart the moment you refuse to be softened. Not because you are unclear, but because you are clear. Not because you are aggressive, but because you are legible in a way that unsettles comfort. This wasn't about the magazine. It was about misalignment. And that same misalignment shows up in love. There is a phrase people like to use when conversations get uncomfortable. They say, not everything has to be a show. Not everything has to be legible to outsiders. And on the surface, that sounds wise. But I want to be very clear. That phrase is often used by people who already control visibility. Because there is a difference between choosing privacy and being orchestrated into erasure. Many NGOs, foreign institutions, and so-called allies understand this difference very well, and they exploit it. They know how to say, we value quiet work, while quietly deciding who gets to be seen. They are not opposed to spectacle, they are opposed to unmanaged visibility. In African queer spaces especially, visibility is treated like a resource. Who gets to be visible, for what, in what way, and at what cost? And the moment you exceed the script, the moment you are too talented, too multidimensional, too political, support becomes conditional. Doors close quietly, introductions stop happening, your work circulates less, your name disappears. Not because you failed, but because you refused containment. I want to speak from my own life here, quietly. Since returning to Ghana, I have watched how people try to decide what I'm allowed to be known for. And at one point, I was subtly positioned as only an HIV activist. Not because that work isn't important, it is. I was already doing it. But because it was the only version of me that was considered acceptable. The unspoken message was, if you stay here, we will support you. If you go beyond this, we won't. That is not allyship. That is management. And when I continued HIV activism in my own way, exposing European racism alongside local homophobia, refusing gratitude politics, making work, like my music video campaign on HIV, Moja Biara Yadom, or Blood is Equal HIV. Things shifted because I didn't fall in line. This is why, when I say love me, the gay way, I'm not just talking about romance. I'm talking about being loved or supported without being erased, without being told, be smaller, be quieter, be only this one thing. Love that requires disappearance is not love. Love that misrecognizes you is not love. Love that only survives when power goes unnamed is not love. Choosing yourself is not cruelty. Choosing boundaries is not arrogance. And refusing to shrink is not an attack. It is self-respect. So if love, romantic, communal, or institutional, cannot meet you fully where you are, it is not a failure to walk away. It is wisdom. May we learn to love in ways that do not ask us to disappear. Until next time, my name is Otiana Kendro, the healer of snake bites.
Timasam namarin tum 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 yeah. Masam namarin tum 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 yeah. Timasam namarin tum 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 yeah. Masam namarin tum. Yamma say bidia groovy. Misenya wanuna durubi, ubema saria uni hoji.